Hello, I'm Steve Lusk with the Red Bank Church of Christ in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And joining me today is Andy Gean, one of our deacons at the Red Bank Church. And we're here to share with you another in our series of lessons that we're calling Disciples in Action. This has been a study of the book of Acts. Today we're looking at the last few verses of Acts chapter 21 and all of chapter 22, where the theme of this particular section, Paul says, listen to my defense, and he defends himself before his people. Andy, thanks for joining us. Looking forward to jumping into this lesson here today.
Yeah, good to be here. I like your blue shirt.
Yeah, we got the memo, didn't we, about the blue shirts? This was not planned, by the way. Sorry, but we're certainly glad that you have joined us. If you're joining us here today, and we encourage you. As we go through this, we're not trying to do this verse by verse, word by word, phrase by phrase to explain and try to understand everything in this book. Not that there's anything wrong with that per se, but our emphasis has to do with discipleship in the book of Acts. And we're trying to answer a couple of questions as we go along here. Number one, how did the early Christians, how did those first century disciples of Jesus carry out the Great Commission? You see, Luke wrote his gospel, the Gospel of Luke, to this Theophilus in order to set in order the things that occurred in the life of Jesus. And of course, the life of Jesus sort of is summarized and comes to its climax when Jesus said, you go to all the world and you make disciples and you baptize them and you teach them and I'll be with you. And then, as Luke begins the book of Acts, Jesus is there with his disciples in the final days before he ascends. He ascends, and he reminds them, here's what I told you to do. You begin at Jerusalem, you go to Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, and take this message. So the book of Acts kind of tells us how Jesus' disciples carried out the Great Commission in the first century. And so what we're trying to do with this is we're trying to ask ourselves the question, then how do we as 21st century disciples carry out the Great Commission today? And what lessons can we learn from these early disciples? What messages are here in that sense for us from the book of Acts? So that's kind of where we've been going with this. That's where we want to continue to go. So I say all that to say this. If we don't answer some question that you have about something in this study, then we urge you continue to study it. If you want to get in touch with us and ask us more questions, that's certainly appropriate. But as we go along here, we invite you to pause the video, read these passages more carefully than we're going to be able to do today with our limited time, and try to understand what's taking place here in the book of Acts. So thanks for joining us. Let's just jump right in here with the end of chapter 21. Now, as chapter 21 unfolds. Back in chapter 20, Paul had left the Ephesian elders at Miletus and had sailed toward Jerusalem. He was wanting to take an offering to the saints in Jerusalem that had been gathered on his third missionary journey throughout Asia Minor, and he took some representatives from these churches with him on this journey. And he was going to try to get there to Jerusalem by the day of Pentecost so that he could help distribute those funds to those needy Christians in and around Jerusalem, in Judea. However, things didn't go quite so well for Paul. He is confronted by Jewish Christians there in Jerusalem and asked to do some things that, as was pointed out in last week's lesson, maybe he did it in order to simply go along with the Jews and to be acceptable to them. But as a result of some of the things he did and going into the temple area and paying some sacrifices for some men who'd made some vows, he's falsely accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple area, of desecrating the temple as a result, of trying to speak against the law of Moses. And so some Jews from Asia really stir up the crowd, and they beat him and caused this uproar. The Roman soldiers who were stationed nearby kind of come to his aid and rescue him from the crowd. And they're about to take him into their barracks as chapter 21 closes here. Their barracks were just adjacent to the temple area. And so they're about to take him in there, and Paul says, hey, may I say something to you? May I speak? He's asked if he speaks Greek, and he says, aren't you the Egyptian? The commander says, aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt, led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago? And Paul said, you've got the wrong man here. I'm Paul. I'm a Jew from Tarsus. It's not an ordinary city. It's a city of means. It's a Roman city. So let me speak to my people. Let me speak to these folks. And so the commander gives him permission. Paul motions. One translation says motions with his hand, motions to the crowd. And he speaks to them in Aramaic, saying, brothers and fathers, listen to my defense. When they heard him speak in Aramaic, they became very quiet. So that's sort of where this chapter closes, and the next chapter, chapter 22, begins. So let's ask a couple of questions here, Andy. First of all, this Roman commander, he apparently assumes Paul is an Egyptian revolutionary. Why would that have been the case? And how was Paul able to clarify who he was?
I don't have all of the historical context on this, and I don't have all the clear answers. But as you and I discussed, the Romans were concerned about one thing, that was occupation and governance. And as we've learned through Jesus, through the early parts of Acts, the Jews were concerned about religion and status quo. And so let me just say, I bet the Jews knew who Paul was. But the Romans, they clearly didn't know who he was. They thought he might have been this person that, Josephus in history talks about, this Egyptian that had tried to lead a revolt. I think it was on the Mount of Olives and had escaped. And so there was just this was such a uprising and such a turmoil that it was mistaken identity. So the Romans didn't know who he was. I don't think they were in tune with everything that was happening in the Jewish world, except whether they were behaving or not. And so,
right, yeah, that's what they really seem to be most concerned about, keeping the peace. One of the things that Rome was known for during this time when they ruled the world was what the Latins call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and so they did everything in their power to keep the peace. And whatever happened with this Egyptian revolutionary. The revolt that he led had led to the slaughter of a lot of people, but he had escaped. And so maybe this commander thought, hey, I'm gonna kind of be a hero here. Maybe I've captured this guy. And he would have been one, because most people in the world spoke Greek at that time, and it would have been assumed that that this Egyptian would have spoken Greek too. But anyway, Paul says, no, you got the wrong guy here. I'm from Tarsus, a Roman city. I'm a Jew. I'm not an Egyptian. He had to clarify that, and so he says, "Just give me a chance to talk." So, but here's a question: Why do you think that these people have just beaten Paul? Okay, tried to kill him. The text says previously in chapter 21, they were trying to beat him to death. So why did he want to address these people that were out to get him, and what did he do to get the people's attention?
Well, I'll start with the second. What did he do? He appealed to them in their language, which apparently was part of what caused the hush.
Right.
And then he appealed to them as who he is, a brother and a sister to them in the Jewish sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so how did he get their attention? That's how he did it. But why do I think, or why does it appear Paul wanted to address the people that were out to get them? Just repeated over and over from the time that Paul was called to the continued ministry. Every time Paul's in Jerusalem, I think he understood that mission and that command that was given to him to go and spread the word. But he, and you said in Romans, as you and I were discussing, that it's very clear that Paul wanted to take this message to his own people too.
Yes.
So I think he was using the opportunity. He had a zeal for his own people, and he can identify, and we'll talk, I guess, at the very end, he can identify, he's no stranger to a mob. So maybe he was cooler than we would be, because That's when we start into his defense, he acknowledges, I know how to run a mob too. So
yeah. You go back to Acts chapter 20, verse 24, and when Paul was talking to those Ephesian elders, one of the things he said was he's headed to Jerusalem because he wants to testify to the Jews of the grace of God. And again, he points out that Paul, just like God, is no respecter of persons. Yes, he was primarily sent to the Gentiles, but he loved his people, the Jews, and he wanted to talk to them. And he thought, if there's a way I can address them here, maybe I can persuade them. Maybe I can change their mind. And we're going to see that by and large, in this setting at least, he wasn't successful by the way we would think of success, but he was successful in that he did get to share his defense and talk to these people. And you know what? While the mob action that we're going to see kind of overrules everything, we don't know whether or not some in that crowd may have been impacted by Paul's words here. So that's an interesting thing for us to consider. He wanted to take advantage of every opportunity, even if it wasn't the best environment possible, to talk to someone about his faith and about God's grace. I'm just amazed at the way Paul took advantage of every situation, even situations that were less than ideal, to say the least. And that would be a case like this for sure. Well, then, beginning in verse 3, he begins to make his defense, which is kind of the theme of this lesson. Listen to my defense, he says. First of all, I'm a Jew. I was born in Tarsus. I was brought up in this city, Jerusalem, he's talking about. He said, I studied under Gamaliel, and I was thoroughly trained. Gamaliel was kind of like the Yale or Harvard of the day. He was one of the chief rabbis of the day, instructors of the day. And if you learned under the feet of Gamaliel, then you really had some credentials. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way, even to the death. He said, I arrested people, threw them into prison, and the high priest and the council can testify to this. There were apparently records there. Some may have even remembered Paul that this would have taken place probably about 20 years before. He tells about the letters that he got going to Damascus, and he was going to take people who were followers of the way of Christ, as prisoners back to Jerusalem. And then he starts telling what happened. He says, about noon, I came near Damascus, a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground, heard a voice say, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And by the way, let me pause right here and say this. This is the second telling of Paul's conversion story. The first telling is back in Acts chapter 9 when it actually occurs, and it's told from the perspective of just a person telling the narrative, here's how it happened. Here, Paul makes it a first-person account. I'm telling you what happened to me. And in Acts chapter 26, he's going to tell it again for a third time in another setting. And yes, each one of these tellings of Paul's conversion have some slight differences of emphasis in them. And so it's best, and I would challenge you as a listener, as a reader of the book of Acts, to go back, reread chapter 9, read this section again, and then go ahead and read chapter 26 and kind of mesh those three together, because in each of the settings, maybe something slightly different is emphasized. Doesn't mean there's a contradiction. It's just as the story is told for different purposes to different people, different things may have been emphasized. So, jump back in the story here. He says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Saul says, who are you, Lord? Jesus claims that he is Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. People with him saw the light, didn't understand the voice, but implies that voice was heard, even though they didn't comprehend what it was saying. Paul wanted to know what to do, and the Lord told him to get up and go into Damascus, and you'll be told what you've been assigned to do, what my message is or my mission is for you. And so he was led by the hand. Remember, he was blind because of the brilliance of the light, led by the hand into Damascus, and a man named Ananias came to see him. He's identified here as a devout observer of the law, highly respected by all the Jews living there. And he said, Brother Saul, receive your sight, and the miracle of vision was granted to him at that very moment. Then he says, the God of our ancestors, Ananias says to Saul at that time, before he becomes the Apostle Paul, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will, to see the righteous one, to hear words from his mouth. You'll be his witness to all people of what you've seen and heard. He says, what are you waiting for? Get up and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. And again, just bring out that whenever conversion stories are told, we see this process taking place. Belief, faith in Jesus as the Christ is emphasized. A desire or a need to repent is encouraged upon those who receive this word, and then they are admonished and encouraged to be baptized with some sense of urgency or immediacy. And we see that taking place here. And so he goes back to Jerusalem, and he's praying at the temple. That's kind of an interesting little phrase there, because remember, he's near the temple grounds here. He's been taken outside the temple gates, and he's claiming that he's a Jew. And so he says, I went back to the temple and I was praying in the temple, and the Lord began to speak to him and says, leave Jerusalem. They're not going to accept you, what you're saying about me. And so he says, Lord, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing me. Wow, I'm sure that was hard for Paul to say on that occasion. Then he says, the Lord said to me, and this is the kicker, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. All right, we'll come back to that here in just a moment. So let's consider a couple things here. What are some of the things that Paul said to try to find common ground with this mob of people who had tried to kill him and who were just causing an uproar, and now we're finally listening to him just a little bit?
I kind of had listed several things. One of them is when you play the Gamaliel card, have some credibility.
Absolutely.
And that was unarguable. Yeah, it had been about 20 years, and I don't know where Gamaliel would be at this point, possibly deceased, maybe still around.
Right.
Playing the Gamaliel card was big. He's paraphrasing himself saying, I get what you're doing. So when you say zeal, he acknowledged their zeal. And, when we think of zeal can be used really well. Zeal can be really bad, but zeal in a negative sense is generally just misplaced energy. It's not bad energy. It's just really misplaced energy. But he's saying, I get your zeal. And as a case in point, Stephen. So he tried to relate with the level of persecution, zeal, Gamaliel. He even describes, as he's talking to God that second time when he comes back and is praying in the temple, I hear a sense of guilt, but I hear a sense of love. I'm back here in this city that I love, and that means so much to me as a Jew. So he's relating from that level. And then he brings in, we've got Gamaliel as somewhat of a testimony, but he's got this witness of this other devout Jew named Ananias. Mm-hmm. That's somewhat of an endorsement of this process of Jew to Jesus follower to a new teaching that is riling everybody up. So
exactly. Exactly. And those are some of the things, and maybe you can find even some more common ground as you look at this text. Paul was trying to relate to these people. He was trying to get them to understand where he had come from and where he was going, which leads me to my next point.
And can I jump in one
second?
second?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
And that's previous of just simply saying, hey, brother.
Right.
Hey, father. So respect. And as you and I will probably talk a little bit later, sometimes we have to change what we do a little bit, and maybe that's a bad phrase, but language. He
yes
spoke their language.
He literally spoke their language, didn't he? A language that they could understand. And while most people in the world could speak Greek, and it was the common language of the people, Aramaic was spoken by the Jews, and they kind of held on to that. Which was sort of that first century form of Hebrew language, and they guarded that jealously. And so when someone could speak in Aramaic, that said, you understand us, you get us. You don't have to speak this official language of Rome, Greek, in order to impress us. You understand where we're coming from. So he literally spoke their language. That's true. Why did Paul tell them about his conversion story? And why would he launch into that at this particular point?
As I kind of just alluded to, I think we can paraphrase what Paul's saying is, I get what's happening, guys. I get it. I mean, because think about it, really what had been done was done. He was being led away, and he just said, hey, can I talk to them? The people that are close to me. And I think he turns it around. He speaks their language. If we were talking about a parent and a kid, he got down on his knees and he said, I get what you're doing. I get what you're doing, and I've got reason to get what you're doing. Gamaliel, I was raised here, and I've got the zeal I have zeal to beat you guys. But like as you and I previously discussed, that this was just a continuation of using every opportunity. If he hadn't got this opportunity, he probably would have talked to the Romans that were leading him away. But just using that opportunity, every opportunity. So,
yes. I guess the simple answer to why he told them his conversion story is ultimately that's what he did. That's what the followers of Jesus do. We share what Jesus has done for us, regardless of what our background is. In Paul's particular case, he said, I can connect with you. I understand where you're coming from as a Jew, but let me tell you about Jesus. Let me tell you about this person that I encountered on the road to Damascus and what I've learned from him and what he's challenged me to do and how he's changed me. And as disciples of Jesus, man, there's a great point for consideration here in the 21st century. We don't have to know every point of doctrine and be able to quote every scripture exactly. Yes, I'm not minimizing that. I'm not saying that's not important, but we ultimately need to be able to tell people how we came to be followers of Jesus. My story is not as dramatic as Paul's. I guess yours isn't either, Andy. I don't know, but the fact is, we all have a story about how we came to faith. And as Christians, as disciples of Jesus, that's what we're called to do. That's what Paul was called to do when he became a follower of Jesus. So whatever else he does in connecting with those people, ultimately he does that in order to tell his story. And that's so very important for us to just get out of this particular chapter. I want to ask this: who is the leading character in Paul's telling of the story, and why is this important?
You're talking about telling stories, so it is exciting when we go from death to life. That is exciting, and that's what we want to convey. But yeah, maybe previous it's not as dramatic. That's what you're saying. Maybe it's not as dramatic, but the Christ part is exciting always. But your question is, who's the leading character? So Paul, in this telling, ensures that we see that Christ is the leading character in this turnaround. And you and I just now spoke about why is this important. As Paul tells this story, we can see a pattern that's probably good for us. It's full honesty about our past,
Mm-hmm.
whether that was maybe even growing up in a family of faith, but full honesty about our past and our sin and our previous state of death, no matter even if we were attending church with our family or whatever as young people, but full honesty about our past, but then full credit to Christ.
Right.
Credit. So anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. While Paul does talk about his credentials, if you will, of Judaism, of Jewishness, ultimately he says Christ is the one who changed me. It's not because I learned at the feet of Gamaliel, or not because I was from Tarsus, or not because I was zealous or whatever. It's because the Lord appeared to me. And if we're not careful, because of our self-centeredness and our selfishness, we can have a tendency to glorify ourselves in all this. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is magnify Christ, push Christ forward, make Christ big in our lives, glorify Him. And I think that's what Paul was trying to do in this particular setting, even to the point of telling those people, this is why I'm going to the Gentiles, because Christ directed me to do this. The Lord spoke to me and told me to do this. He's trying to clarify for them what it is he's doing and why he's doing it. And ultimately, if I could just paraphrase it in a one sentence, he says, it's all about Jesus. All of this is happening because of Jesus. And that's so important for us to understand as well. Well, let's look at this last section here of this particular chapter. The crowd listened apparently quietly and respectfully to Paul until he said this. What did he say? The Lord sent me to the Gentiles. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. And just chaos ensues. They shout, they throw their cloaks and fling dust in the air. And the commander, the Roman commander, who's kind of had allowed Paul to speak there from the steps of the barracks, he says, take him inside, get him out of here. And so then he says, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And the way that they got to the bottom of things like this with insurrectionists was beat the truth out of them. And so he orders him to be flogged and questioned to try to figure out what is going on. Why are these people so torn up with you? And so they stretch him out to flog him. And you can almost envision this. There was probably a whipping post of some kind, and they would maybe tie a person's hands around him or sometimes stretch him over that post. And he's stretched out to be beaten or to be scourged, as some translations say. And so Paul says to the centurion, this big mighty Roman who's standing there, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? Well, when the centurion heard this, boom, he stopped. He went to the commander. He reports it. He says, so what are you going to do about this? He said, this man's a Roman citizen. So the commander goes to Paul. He says, are you a Roman citizen? He said, yes, I am. So then he says, now I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. How did you get yours? Paul says, well, I was born a citizen. Now, just to be born in Tarsus did not necessarily imply that you were a citizen, even though it was a citizen as a province of, it was a city that was in a province of Rome. To be born a citizen means that your family had Roman citizenship, and so you were born into a Roman citizenship that way. Now, since Paul's family was Jewish, and he says later his father was even a Pharisee, there's some question as to how had this Roman citizenship been conferred upon them, and really it's just speculation. We have no idea. Some have suggested that maybe his father had done something to help the Romans in some way, and so Roman citizenship had been conferred upon them. We don't really know, but he was born into a Roman family, and therefore he was a Roman citizen. So these people who were about to beat him, interrogating him, jumped back. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. And so he wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused. So he released him. Doesn't mean he released him from prison. He released him from this situation that he was in of being flogged and tied to this beating post, and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. And he brought Paul and had him stand before them. And we're going to pause right here and sort of leave you hanging with what happens in the next chapter, okay? So that's sort of everything that leads up to what's going to take place that we'll look at next week in chapter 23. So let's ask a couple of questions about this. Why did the crowd get so riled up at him once again? They had gotten calmed down after beating him. The Romans took over. Paul speaks to them, and they listen respectfully. Then they get riled up again. What made him so angry?
You know, he worked really hard to find common ground with them, but there was, and maybe they were listening. Maybe they were quiet and they were listening and processing it, but and maybe they were even open to listening how God had changed Paul the Jew. Mm-hmm. Once the Gentiles were brought into this, that was it. And I guess the take-home point of that, you know, you're saying we're trying to see what happened in the first century and how do we apply this in the 21st century. We've just had some discussion about let's be open, let's be quiet, let's listen. Let's listen to the word, let's listen to others, teach about the word, but let's also be introspective to acknowledge some things where we stop listening and not be like that crowd. Or I guess you and I kind of said that, or kind of acknowledged that there might be something in some of us that just hits that sensitive spot and makes us react like that, and we got to rid ourselves of that. So that's not a good trait, as we could kind of see here.
Yeah, we probably all have hot buttons, don't we? I mean, certain things that if they're brought up or if they're pointed out or if they're said, we just lose all sense of rationality and reasonability, and we just shut down. And that seems to be what happens to this Jewish crowd when the idea of going to the Gentiles is brought up. Now, it makes you wonder, and maybe we could just kind of explore and ask the question for deeper consideration. How did the Jews get to this point? Because that's not what God originally promised Abraham. He had promised Abraham that through your seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. But somehow or another, over the course of the centuries, the Jews had gotten the idea that God was sort of their exclusive domain, and they were the exclusive domain of God. And nobody else was to be included unless they became a Jew first, and adhere to all the things of the law of Moses. And that was a real problem, especially when Christianity came into being. And we see it already has caused a lot of problems in the book of Acts. And so when this idea of Gentiles and Gentiles maybe being brought into the temple and all that is brought up, man, it just gets them so fired up. And man, prejudice is a powerful thing. It really is. And we need to challenge the prejudices that we have here in the 21st century so that we don't just shut people off or shut down a situation and refuse to listen and just lose all sense of control. That's the challenge for us. And then the Romans are about to beat the truth out of Paul to try to figure out what's going on here. But he says something to stop them. What did he say, and what caused him to be so alarmed?
He played his Roman citizenship card, knowing the process, and we know Paul was well educated, and he understood the process, and he probably understood why the Jews were acting the way they did, but he knew the process of Roman governance, and he knew this wasn't right, and they became very alarmed because even for them, the guards, this could become a dicey situation to take a Roman citizen that hadn't been really formally accused of anything. They were so anyways.
Yeah, they would have had to pay the price for violating the rights of his Roman citizenship, and so he just says, "Oh, by the way, are you supposed to beat a Roman citizen without a trial?" And they were like, "Uh-oh, we have messed up now." And so they really start backing off of this. And we're going to see even in the next chapter how this commander tries to even maybe retell the story in a little bit different light as he's passing this information along to higher authorities. So, but yeah, it was an alarming situation for the Romans because, they did value the laws and, as you said earlier, the governance of their kingdom. Well, let's close out. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, even as we close, this is more than just incidental. It's playing into what he has been told by God, and
right.
by Ananias, it's going to be part of this, but it's more than incidental. So I guess we'll close it out, and I think we'll probably come back around to it. But
absolutely, and of course, the very fact that Paul's desire was to get to Rome, and God's working this thing out. And he's working out a way for Paul to eventually get to Rome. Wasn't probably on a luxury liner like he is perhaps hoping for, but he's going to eventually get to Rome in order to preach to the people there.
To say it a better way, it's more than incidental to just get off the beating post.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's close it out.
Okay, so a couple of questions just for your consideration and for your discussion in your small group or with your family or just as you're studying this on your own. Ask the question, can you speak the language? And I use that phrase in quotation marks. I'm not talking about speaking a foreign language, but just talking to your friends and neighbors in a way that they can understand. Can you relate to your neighbors and your friends in things that matter to them and that they can connect with? And then how can doing this, being able to relate to friends and neighbors, how can this help to reach out to them with the gospel?
Yeah, when you kind of approached it from the light of, if we're talking about cars, can I get in there and knowing nothing about cars, but socialize first with my brothers and then somehow use that to bring them around to talking about salvation and the gospel. So If it's gardening, talking to you about gardening. If it's college football and you don't know anything about college football, can we jump in there and get this versus staying away from it? And can we get in there and mingle, speak the language of the environment that we're in, and then get it, just like Paul did, tell some kind of story that gets around to the truth of the gospel. I think that's one of the things you're kind of alluding to when you were kind of talking about speaking the language of the situation. And when I kind of answered this question just personally, I guess I then started thinking, it's like, do I speak up in situations? So do we even kind of speak up first of all? Paul could have been pulled away, but he took advantage of the situations. And so do we speak up in situations that we might not be comfortable or comfortable with? But then as we talk about speaking the language, I think it's really important just when we're speaking the language to tell our story fully, tell our story honestly, and then just like Paul did when he said, brothers and fathers, literally speaking their language, trying to relate to them through what little things he had in common, such as Gamaliel and Ananias, and acknowledging their zeal and his zeal, just finding common spots. So sorry for a long answer, but kind of you and I both have talked to that from 2 or 3 different angles.
Yeah, and ultimately, discipleship it needs to be relational. That's what Jesus did. You think about it. He called a small group of men to himself, and he spent 3 or 3.5 years with them, building a relationship, showing them how to live. He didn't just say the first day to them, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go preach the gospel to the whole world. He didn't start there. He said, I'm going to make you something. I want you to come and go with me. Come and see, follow me, live with me, work with me, walk with me. And so I think this question challenges us to think in terms of relational discipleship. Not necessarily literally speaking language. That doesn't mean I have to find out all about cars in order to be buddies with my friends or my neighbors, but it means that I need to understand that that's what's important to them. That's what they value. That's something that they can connect with. That can be a point of connection or contact with them for me. And that helps me then to be able to talk to them about something that's of value to me. If I go in and the first thing I say is, I'm a Christian and you need to be one too, then that may not resonate, but if I say, hey, I understand what it's like to struggle with this, that, or the other, and to be able to relate to them in some way, then I think that makes all the difference in spreading the gospel. Well, and then finally, just ask this question, and maybe there's no answer here. I don't know. Maybe you can think of some illustrations here, but is there a modern equivalent to Paul's questioning his beating or his flogging because of his citizenship? In other words, claiming his right as a citizen. And then when and how should we claim our rights in the face of opposition or persecution or disagreement from someone else?
I have no specific answer to that first one, but when we just think about citizenship, Paul tells us more. Philippians, he says, my citizenship, though I am a Jew, though I am Roman, and he's proud of both of those. My citizenship's in heaven, and citizenship on earth was obviously not his end goal, but we can learn from Paul. He wasn't trying to just hold on to the rights or liberties that he had as a Roman, but let's be wise. Let's be wise, and when we get a chance to use what privileges and liberties and rights we do have for the furtherance of the gospel, let's do it rather than being silent. Let's do it in the face of not popularity or not being a popular voice, because he played this Roman card, but it only led him to further imprisonment. But hey, we can still learn there. Philippians, we learned that he was praying for the people who were guarding him. So we just learned so much about opportunities and seizing the opportunities from Acts and from the epistles.
Our country is sustained by what we call a constitution and a Bill of Rights. And so our history is based on rights and being able to have these rights and uphold these rights and defend these rights. And and claim these rights. And we're such a rights-driven culture. And yet there are times when we need to give up our rights for the sake of the gospel. But in this particular case, Paul claimed his right as a Roman citizen not to be beaten, not because he cared about being beaten. He'd just been beaten by an unruly mob. He wasn't afraid of being beaten. He didn't value his own life, but he valued the opportunity to preach the gospel to other people. And so that's how he used the government to further the gospel's cause. And that's what we should do also. Romans 13 reminds us that God has put the government here to protect those who are innocent. And one thing that jumps out in all of these trials of Paul, he's not guilty of anything. He hasn't broken the Roman law. Now, he's a sinner. He acknowledges that. But he hasn't broken the Roman law. He hasn't broken Jewish laws. He's innocent in all this, and yet he's being persecuted. And so whenever he can claim his rights as a Roman citizen, he does. We're going to see this happening again a little bit later when he claims his right to a trial even before Caesar. He does it not for the sake of just being a pioneer or a crusader, but rather to crusade for the cause of Christ. Well, Andy, thanks for joining us today. You always have so many good insights. I appreciate you and your family and your example, and just thank you for helping us out with this lesson today. Our prayer, of course, is that you as a viewer or listener to this particular program will try to understand the things that the book of Acts shares. And as we've tried to make some application points, then you'll make some application points in your own life as well. Because as 21st century disciples, we have a responsibility and a divine opportunity to take the gospel to the world. And that's our prayer. Of course, if there's ever anything we can do to help you at the Red Bank Church of Christ, please let us know. Contact us. We'll do all we can to help you. Thanks for joining us today. We bid you Godspeed. God bless.